Okay, everyone, this meeting is being recorded. You should see a pop-up on your screen. Please just hit continue. We're going to get started in just a moment. I wanted to, again, we've had a couple more folks join. Everyone, if you could please make sure your Zoom is in speaker view, not gallery view. That will give you the best viewing of our press conference this morning. I have been made aware in the chat that on a phone, you can usually swipe left to toggle between speaker and gallery view. So if you're tuning in on a phone, you can try that out. And if you're on a desktop or a laptop, you can look to your Zoom screen in the upper left-hand corner and look for the 9 small squares or the bigger square with 3 small squares under it to toggle between speaker and gallery. And again, speaker view will be better for today's program. So in the interest of everybody's time, I'd like to go ahead and get started. So first, hello everyone. Thank you so much for taking time out of your day to attend today's press conference. My name is Jocelyn Rosnick. I'm Policy Director for the ACLU of Ohio. We're absolutely thrilled that you're here today to be with us for our launch of our latest report, Ohio Could Save Big by Implementing Bail Reform, a Fiscal Impact Analysis. This report is 2 years in the making. It took a lot of outreach, data collection, data analysis, and thorough research and writing to be able to produce a true fiscal impact analysis on the cost savings of bail reform right here in Ohio. For years, bail reform has been at the center of public conversation, and that's no surprise because on any given day, over 12,000 unsentenced people are in Ohio's jails. That's nearly 2/3 of our total jail bed usage. And these people aren't in jail for what they've allegedly done. They're there because of what they don't have in their wallet. Many of us at the ACLU, both nationally and here in Ohio, have seen cost savings in other studies from out of state. We were determined to do a similar cost saving study right here in Ohio in our own backyard. To discuss our new report and the need for bail reform across Ohio, we're honored to have a remarkable list of panelists. We will first lead a brief discussion with the panel, and then we will open the press conference up to Q&A. So I do ask if members of the press have questions for us that you hold them until we make it through the first round of panel questions. I'd like to start by offering our sincere thanks to Chief Justice Maureen O'Connor of the Supreme Court of Ohio, Claire Chevrier, Policy Counsel at the ACLU of Ohio, Michael Wilson, our expert economist for this fiscal impact analysis, Maurice Jennings, bail reform activist and advocate, Judge John Russo of the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas, and Micah Derry with Americans for Prosperity, a member of the Ohio Conservatives for Bail Reform. So with that, again, just a reminder to be in speaker view and to please hold your questions. Let's get started. Chief Justice O'Connor, I'd like to thank you again for sharing your morning with us. And I also want to thank you for your leadership on criminalization of poverty issues, including the many harms associated with cash bail. I'm wondering, is now the time for bail reform in Ohio? And why have you been such a strong advocate for change?
Well, thank you for the invitation to participate today. You know, we've known each other for a long time, and I've been involved with the ACLU on this topic for quite some time. I have been a strong advocate for bail reform because, like so many people who seriously look at this problem, they realize that it is only a matter of money and not a reflection on necessarily the charges, the person who has been arrested and detained, or any of the other issues or factors that should be taken into consideration. It's purely what's in your pocket and what can you do to buy your way out of the situation temporarily pre-trial. And this we're talking about, obviously, bail, which is another, the opposite of bail is that you're in pre-trial detention if you cannot make bail. We know the horrors that flow from pre-trial detention to the lives of those who are detained. And you have people who have been affected by it directly, and I'm sure they will be speaking, so I'm not going to delve into that too deeply, except to the fact that even as little as 3 days in detention can literally ruin someone's life going forward. loss of residence, loss of a support system, oftentimes loss of a job or two, depending on how many jobs that the individual may have. So the socioeconomic on the individual, and that's just not fair. You know, the purpose of bail in our Constitution, historically, ever since its origins in England, was as a method to be released, not a method to be detained. And somehow that morphed in the United States. And the mentality became, let's set a high bail so we can keep them in jail. When in reality, the only reason someone should be detained pre-trial is if they are a flight risk, and that means they're not going to show up to answer for the charges against them, or they are going to continue with criminal activity that is going to endanger a person or you know, a group that has been, you know, either the victim or they're going to be terrorizing the witnesses, intimidating the witnesses, that sort of thing. So it's the protection element. Those are the two factors that you take into consideration. And another thing that I think is so important in this discussion are conditions of release, pretrial conditions that are non-monetary. And oftentimes those are not front and center as alternatives to just saying, you've got a 5,000 10% bail, or you've got a 50,000 10% bail, etc. So it affects our society negatively. It drains the coffers of the community with, you know, our precious resources we don't have to waste. It does absolutely no good. In other words, you can't point to a benefit. That's what I think is so telling. You cannot point to a benefit of having someone who is not, again, dangerous or flight risk of being detained pre-trial. And I think that's extremely telling. The report and the racial analyses here in this era, in this recent you know, time, it's always relevant, but I think it resonates more impactfully because of what we've experienced here in the United States in the last you know, 4 or 5 months. So yes, it is timely. Yes, it's relevant. And yes, this is the tip of the iceberg. There's more to be done. There's more studies to be done. You have a limited base for the studies for this report, and understandably so. But the name of the game is data collection. And I'm a huge advocate of data collection, as you probably know, from my recent, you know, speaking on the, well, forever, but more recently. And so, you know, they mesh together, and we need to collect data in order to tell us how we're doing, the direction that we're going in. Are we using resources honestly and intelligently? And it also guides where we go. So with that, I'm going to close and let other people talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chief Justice. You know, here at the ACLU of Ohio, we're big fans of data collection as well, and we thank you for the work that you're doing in that area and many areas in the criminalization of poverty. I'd like to turn to Claire Chevrier, Policy Counsel at the ACLU of Ohio. Claire, can you kick us off by talking a little bit about the important takeaways from our new report? How much can Ohio really save? What changes will get us there?
Absolutely, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here. So as Jocelyn and Chief Justice O'Connor just outlined, we know that Ohio's over-reliance on cash bail creates a two-tiered system of justice in which those with money and resources can buy their freedom and return home to their families. And too often those without resources are forced to languish in jail unnecessarily. And we also know that this creates, you know, incredible hardship for those individuals and their families and their communities, but also for their landlords and their employers. What we didn't really know was how much money the system really costs Ohio taxpayers, not just the individuals who become wrapped up in the system, but actual taxpayers, every one of us. So we wanted to know how much money would common sense bail reform cost or save, And in fact, a lot of times, as Jocelyn mentioned, when advocates in the state of Ohio have previously made cost savings arguments, we've been called out because people have pointed out that actually all of those cost savings we're pointing to are from reports outside of Ohio or from different jurisdictions. And we were asked, has an expert economist ever looked at Ohio data to make Ohio-specific statewide takeaways? And the answer was no, and so we decided to change that. And so that's why the ACLU of Ohio hired Mike Wilson, who you're about to hear from. And so over the last 2 years working with Mike, we've been analyzing court and jail data. And so now the numbers are in and they're quite honestly shocking. So his analysis shows that if our common sense bail reform policy proposals were implemented, Ohio would save between $199 and $264 million each year. And I'll let that sink in for a second. $199 to $264 million each year. So when I say common sense bail reform policies, what do I really mean? And this is in our report, and it's really the crux of our report in many ways because it's these policies who are making these cost estimates, these cost savings estimates about. So our policy proposals were created to respond to 3 goals. 1, ending wealth-based detention. 2, saving taxpayer dollars. And 3, promoting public safety. Because we know that cash bail currently does not promote public safety. It just allows some people to buy their freedom, even if they might pose a threat. And then, as Chief Justice O'Connor just stated, it also causes some people to remain in jail unnecessarily simply because they don't have the money in their pocket to buy their release. So what we propose is that legislators create for everyone what currently only exists for the wealthy, and that's a release valve. And instead of having it be determined based on what you have in your pocket, we want it to actually be based on whether or not you're a flight risk or whether or not you are a risk to you pose a threat to a specific person. So we propose that through a strong presumption of release, most people charged with a crime should be released the same day as their arrest, unless a prosecutor or a judge is concerned that the person is a flight risk or poses a threat to a specific person. In which case, then a conditions of release hearing should be held. And we also propose that those conditions of release hearings be held within 48 hours of the accused person's arrest and detention if they have not already been released through the release valve. And at that hearing, our hope would be that the judge could set any number of different conditions of release that might be available to them in that court, whether it's pretrial supervision, employment requirements, GPS monitoring, or even cash bail. And that's because our proposals aren't to end cash bail, it's to end wealth-based detention. And of course, we also believe that for those charged with the most serious crimes for which preventative detention is available, the conditions of release hearings could turn into a preventative detention hearing, and all of the different preventative detention procedural safeguards that currently exist should obviously be maintained. So I want to note that while these proposals were developed with the main goals of promoting public safety and ending wealth-based detention and saving taxpayer dollars, we also really listened when we heard concerns during Chief Justice O'Connor's Supreme Court Task Force on Bail Reform from judges from non-metro areas who spoke up because they have, smaller staff and certainly fewer judges. And we heard the concerns about, how would smaller court systems handle these kinds of proposals. But our hope is that if the presumption of release works as it's intended to, most people should be released pre-trial, and then a further set out initial court date could be set. It would only be that smaller group of individuals who pose a threat who would be entitled to those quicker hearings. And so going back to the numbers a little bit, and this is one of the key takeaways from the report, based on the counties we analyzed, 63% of people held in jail pre-trial were charged with a misdemeanor or a non-person felony, so a felony that didn't involve contact with another human being, like drug possession. And that population alone costs an estimated $195 to $253 million annually to hold in jail pre-trial. And so this percentage is really important because obviously, we gave our policy recommendations to Mike to try to figure out how much money they would save. But we also made, our policy proposals were informed by our understanding of who's in jail in Ohio. If 3% of people in jail in Ohio were charged with a misdemeanor or a non-person felony, and 97% were charged with a, legitimate were legitimately accused of aggravated murder, we wouldn't be able to say we should release this many people. But we know that that's not at all the reality. In fact, we know that overwhelmingly those who are held in jail pretrial are charged with misdemeanors or non-person felony as their most significant charge. We recognize that those people probably shouldn't remain in jail, and we know that currently too many of them are in jail, not because of what they've done, not because of their charge, not because of, you know, any level of certainty regarding culpability, but simply because they don't have the money to buy their freedom. So I'm certainly happy to answer more questions about policy proposals once everyone on the panel gets through their initial questions. But I also want to make one other note. So the huge numbers that I shared earlier, the $199 to $264 million each year of savings, also took into account not just savings from decreased jail populations, it also took into consideration increased cost of pretrial supervision. So while we definitely think that everybody who is released from jail requires pretrial supervision, we recognize that if a lot more people were being released, there would be increases to cost of pretrial supervision. So we actually chose the very conservative route, and we, for every single person who we counted as released under our policy proposals for the cost benefit analysis, we actually had them incur a cost of pretrial supervision. And we chose to use pretrial supervision costs from Cleveland. We're actually on a slightly higher spectrum as far as cost. And so that huge number, again, $199 to $264 million each year, includes both cost savings, but also costs. And that's the number that we get. And so that just reminds us that, especially given the economic shortfalls that are expected due to the pandemic and decreased tax revenue, there has really never been a better time or a more urgent time for true bail reform that's focused on making sure that more people are released pre-trial. And so we are so glad that this report can serve as a vetted reminder of that.
Thank you so much, Claire. I think it bears repeating. Ohio could save big, and by big we mean $199 to $264 million every single year. That's quite an astonishing number, and I'm really excited now to hear how that really is a conservative estimate. We'll turn it over to Michael Wilson. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what the report looks at. What do we mean when we're talking about a truly conservative cost savings?
Sure. Thank you, Jocelyn. And yeah, I did want to cover two pieces here. One is, and the Chief Justice brought this up as well, the importance of data collection. Hopefully I won't bore you too much with these details. I want to talk a little bit about the detail of what went into this, the data that was collected, and then from that data, we're able to look at who's in jail pretrial, what are they in for, we broke that out by demographics, and then we're able to attach dollars and cents to that, and I want to talk through that briefly as well. So the good news is the Chief Justice mentioned how important data is for the state. You all are collecting a lot of this important data. So we were able to look at jail data from multiple jurisdictions, court data from multiple jurisdictions, pretrial services data from one jurisdiction. And so we're able to pull a ton of data into what we're looking at. The bad news, or the part that made this challenging, is that the data isn't the easiest to get to. They're in systems that don't necessarily talk to one another. There are challenges in figuring out how to merge data together. And so we spent a month actually working on this to merge data across 4 different jurisdictions, 12 different agencies, to really make sense of what's happening around the state, and again in 4 jurisdictions, but to make sense of what's happening in the pretrial system, of who's coming in, what sorts of crimes are they being charged with, and then you know, moving into I'm sorry, are you all hearing me? It looks like I'm muted.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, it says I'm muted. Sorry, I want to make sure that you can still hear me. So, and then looking at those impacts. So if we were to make changes that Claire pointed out, if we were to make those changes, how many fewer jail beds would be used up? How many fewer individuals would be behind bars? And then putting the cost estimate along with that. So I want to move in then to the cost estimate of how we arrived at our costs. And I want to go back to a concept that I use a lot in my Economics 101 class, is the difference between average and marginal costs. And this can be somewhat technical. I'm going to try to keep it at a high level. But really, the simple way to estimate cost is an average cost. And that's often what.
Oh, we have lost the audio for Mike.
All right, am I back now?
You're back.
Sorry, everyone, having some technical difficulties. So going back to the average versus marginal cost, and normally these sorts of studies look at average cost. They take the entire budget divided by the number of individuals who are in jail to figure out a cost per day of jail. And that's an easy way of doing this, but it's not always accurate, because when you look at having smaller changes in the number of people who are in jail, you don't have changes in some of the fixed costs. You don't have changes in administrative staff and supervisors. A lot of those positions stay the same. So we wanted to take a more conservative estimate and only look at those costs that change when population fluctuates, things like food and linens, medical expenses. And then when you have larger changes, we can look at things like staffing changes, frontline correctional officers, positions being unfilled, and vacancies in those areas. So we took that approach in this estimate, and it makes a big difference. When we're looking at Cuyahoga County, for example, the average cost for a day in jail is in the $120 plus a day range. But when we look at a marginal cost estimate, it's much lower, closer to $89. Similarly, in Franklin County, we saw around $110 a day for average costs, but the marginal costs were closer to $89 a day. So using that marginal cost provides a more conservative estimate. And then, as Claire had mentioned, we also looked at pretrial services costs. So those jail savings are somewhat offset by costs for pretrial services, and we made an assumption that everyone would receive pretrial services, which, as we know, isn't necessary, but again, we wanted to be conservative on these estimates. So we subtracted those costs off to arrive at that big number that we've heard earlier, the 199 to 264 million. And then finally, there are additional costs as well that we didn't try to incorporate, and we'll hear more during Maurice's time speaking about the potential impact of earnings being impacted by this, lost wages. There's also research around spending more than a few days in jail pretrial has a big impact on the outcome, the disposition of the case, how likely you are to receive prison sentences, longer sentences, and even recidivism down the road. So there are many other costs that research is beginning to point to, and then we didn't try to pull that in because we wanted to make sure we had a very straightforward, more conservative estimate that was looking primarily at jail costs and then the offsetting pretrial services costs.
Okay, thank you so much, Michael. I think we first connected way back in August 2018. This report really is 2 years in the making. I know you've mentioned it before that you looked at data from multiple jurisdictions, nearly 1 million records. So I appreciate your time and analysis and helping explain how this truly is at the low end of what Ohio could save. I think, you know, the 199 to 264, it could be much higher annually if we added in some of these other cost savings that we couldn't complete in our own study. So I would like to turn it over to Maurice Jennings, who is going to share his story with us this morning. Maurice, thank you so much for being here with us. I'm wondering if you could just walk us through your personal experience with cash bail.
Okay. In 2018, May 1st, I was falsely accused of a shooting. I was charged with 2 counts of felonious assault and a gun spec. I was arrested and I had a bail set for $250,000. 10 days later, when I got indicted, it was raised to $500,000. My family hired a lawyer, but due to like hundreds of inmates being in one pod trying to use the phone, you got to stand in a long line. And then either when you do get on the phone, you got to hope that your family's available or your attorney available, because they can be out helping other clients or just living their life. Or my family might not have money on the phone at that point in time. But I eventually got bonded out. And thanks to a good, fair judge and a new lawyer, my case got dismissed, proving that I was at work because of my timesheet. I spent 4 months incarcerated with people who didn't have a chance, who just take pleas, like just want to go home to their family, or they've been overcharged, and then they just like, oh, they don't want to take the chance of losing, so they'll just take as much time they feel as possible that they can handle. But April 4th, 2019, my case was dismissed. But ever since then, even with me being out, I done lost my job that I had for 5 years. I was stationed at Procter & Gamble doing security through Securitas. I had that job for 5 years. I lost my apartment. I lost my car. So it's tremendous stress. It caused tremendous stress on my family, even after the situation. And even when I was going through the situation, because my daughter, I missed her birthday, my mom's 70th birthday, my Father's Day being locked up. So it was all a new experience to me. So my son, he used to spend summers with me. So I was locked up during the summertime, so he still had to be with his mama. We had to explain that to a 12-year-old boy. So it's a lot that's going on. That's why I like the Bill Reform campaign and the ACLU, just to spread awareness and keep people having faith.
Thank you so much, Maurice. Again, I'm so sorry that this happened to you and the ripple effect that it's had on your life. And I just really commend you for your courage and your leadership in speaking out and being a bail advocate and being here today and in other ways sharing your story. This is how change happens. So I really do appreciate you taking the time. I'd like to switch gears to Judge Russo now. I want to thank you again for assisting us in getting the data necessary in Cuyahoga County to help make our report a reality. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you felt it was important to participate in this type of fiscal impact analysis.
Yeah, so thank you again for allowing me the opportunity to speak today. Just to be, again, very brief, I have a 16-year career as a judge, 12 years prior to that in private practice and criminal defense work. And I think during those 28 years, the inequities that I've seen because of bail and bond have always been something that was a drive for me, that if there was opportunities to move the system, that I would want to play a part in that. I then would say we had the stars line up because I was in a leadership position here in the court for the 6 years prior to this year as the administrative presiding judge. And then the challenge came from the Chief Justice. And not only from the Chief Justice here in Ohio, but nationally as well, with looking at the bail bond and looking at bail bond reform. And that gave me that opportunity, Jocelyn, to step into the fray and say, how can I help? How can we look at what might be a problem? How can we gather data to help? And those were the discussions that I began to have here in the court, but also with the stakeholders here in Cuyahoga County. And gathering that data was important. And I think important, first of all, to just give us the results. You don't know what the results are going to be, and you can't speak to a problem unless you are result oriented. So giving that data, that was a challenge in itself because of we did have it, but how could we gather it in one area and get it to you in order to have Mike take a look at it? And so that was challenging, but getting those results to you and that data to you has clearly, now that I've had a chance to preview the report, is pointing to problems that exist here in the state of Ohio and in Cuyahoga County, and then the challenge of how do we change. And really that's where you have come in, and those who are looking to move the pendulum on bail and bond reform. I think the challenge initially was, as the administrative presiding judge, how do I get that data to you? And the team here in Cuyahoga County was great in getting it to you. And now looking at the results, I can see how it's been beneficial. It's the challenge now that I make to the stakeholders here in the state of Ohio, the stakeholders here in Cuyahoga County, is once they've had the opportunity to look at the report, to look at the problems, and to look at how can we solve some of those problems, The challenge now that I will make to those stakeholders and to the leaders here in Cuyahoga County and the state are how can we take your common sense proposals and move forward in a positive way here in Ohio. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm on the sideline, quote, because I'm not in that leadership role, but my voice is not going to go anywhere, and I'm looking forward to continuing to play a part in these common sense proposals and see how I might be able to help move the pendulum.
Well, thank you again, Judge Russo. You really were a tremendous help in making connections and helping us get that data in Cuyahoga County. And we look forward to continuing to work with you in the various roles that you do have, and you're an important voice in speaking out for change in this area. So our last panelist, last but certainly not least, is Micah Derry with Americans for Prosperity, which is part of the Ohio Conservatives for Bail Reform. Micah, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about why Americans for Prosperity supports bail reform and what's really the conservative case for support.
Thank you so much for having me, Jocelyn. This issue is truly one that should speak to conservatives all over the country, and certainly here in Ohio. You know, the traditions of our constitutional republic require a presumption of innocence, and it is morally and ethically untenable to not also extend that imperative to incarceration. For someone to be held behind bars that is not a threat to other individuals, that is not a flight risk, before they even get convicted of a crime, is absolutely at the core of conservative values, and why the Conservatives for Bail Reform have come together in Ohio to really give voice to that issue. And what's particularly excellent and about why this is a healthy process and why it's time for Ohio to take action, I think back to what Supreme Court Justice Louis Brandeis said, where a single courageous state, if its citizens choose, serve as a laboratory and try novel and social and economic experiments without risk to the rest of the country. And that's not the call for Ohio to be the courageous state here. States from Alaska to New Jersey have already taken action. In fact, we even have local leaders here in Ohio that have also taken action to begin implementing changes along these lines. Right here in Columbus, just a couple blocks away from my office here, we've got Columbus City Attorney Zach Klein that has already instructed his attorneys in the city to not pursue a bail release or to be held on bail for nonviolent crimes. This is an example of our country functioning the way it should from a federalist philosophy. And we want to ensure that as we move forward, that Ohio learns from those states that some of the other states have made in their reform process and recognize that we are in an unprecedented time right now. We saw earlier this year with the COVID-19 outbreak in prisons right here in Ohio, when our prisons are overpopulated, when our jails are overpopulated, it is so much harder to maintain any kind of standard that we all believe as Americans that we should provide in safety for those that are behind bars, that the wards of the state. Bail is one excellent tool, this bail reform, not just in the financial savings, but when it comes to what we expect, and as this study covers, but when we're talking about a situation like a pandemic, the costs that get incurred because of our failed policies that have resulted in over-incarceration, those costs as well get to be mitigated. Given what we're looking at in the coming year in Ohio in regards to our budget and the decreased tax revenues, we absolutely have the imperative right now from a moral, ethical, and fiscal perspective, we have to begin instituting reform sooner rather than later.
I completely agree. Thank you so much, Micah. I think when we first set out to work on this report 2 years ago, we had no idea that we'd be releasing it in the midst of a global pandemic and at a time where Ohio is going to be facing a budget crisis that we don't even know how big it is yet, that there is an imperative for our lawmakers and our leaders to take a look at ways that we can save the state money and do it without having any negative effect and actually benefit public safety and benefit Ohio communities. So thank you for being with us here today. I would like to say thank you again to all of our panelists. Thank you so much for your brief remarks this morning. We would like to now first open up questions to members of the press who have joined us today. Please feel free to unmute yourself and say your name and the agency that you're with, and then ask your question. And then time permitting, we will actually open up the floor to questions to all of our participants. But we would again like to first open it up to members of the press.
This is Danny Eldridge with Hannah News Service. Can you just talk about what the next step is of this report? And are you going to propose this as part of the budget coming up, the next budget, or how's that going to work?
Absolutely, I can go ahead and answer that question. So part of why this report is coming out now, not just because it's Constitution Day today, but because we did want to get this information in the hands of legislators so that they could start considering it for the next budget round. And again, all of our policy proposals that are in this report are geared towards legislators. We do think that legislative action is probably the best vessel for bail reform now. While we're looking, of course, and haven't ruled any other options out, the level of specificity that true bail reform would require in order to really change practices in courtrooms across Ohio really lends itself to to changes in the Ohio Revised Code. And so that's why we are focused on legislators, and we do hope that they take into consideration the really massive savings that this research and report provides when they start working on the budget early next session.
Thank you so much, Claire. And yes, this report is being released publicly today. It went live at 10:30, and every single member of our General Assembly will receive a digital and physical hard copy. Next question. Okay, I see we have a pause. I do want to note that there was a question posed in the chat asking how many people charged with misdemeanors or non-person contact felonies are in for failure to appear. And we have some of that data, but we didn't dive into that specific situation. So we don't have the answer to that question today. But Claire, if you wanted to add anything else, please feel free.
Sure, so I definitely can't give you a percentage. We looked at it, but we don't have it readily available. But we do definitely have an advocacy and policy answer for this. So part of why when our policy proposals look at whether or not somebody is a flight risk is because we want to steer away from people being held unnecessarily in jail because judges are concerned about appearance. There's a difference between, concerns about appearance versus concerns about an active flight risk. And you're correct that obviously that what we unfortunately see in Ohio all the time is that there's a criminalization of poverty at the time that bond is set in some jurisdictions. For example, if somebody's unable to provide an address, then a judge might have a concern about appearance and therefore set a higher bond amount that leads to detention. But that is wealth-based detention. That person is being held, one, because there was a concern that they wouldn't be able to appear because they don't have an address, and two, because they didn't have the money to then post for their bond. So part of our policy proposal is taking into consideration that the focus should be on, is somebody an active flight risk as opposed to somebody a concern about appearance. And that's because there's actually really easy ways to make sure that people appear in jail. And jail is one of the most expensive, most complicated, and most harmful ways to assure that somebody appears. Overwhelmingly, one of the best tools to cause somebody to remember to come to court is a text or a phone reminder. But there's also a lot of other things that are happening in different jurisdictions. People have looked at, different jurisdictions have looked into, well, can your slip count as a bus pass for the day? Is your order to go to court, can that be free transportation for the day? Can you be reminded, whether it's by text or by phone or by letter, whichever is easiest for you? And in fact, those kinds of tools actually get people to jail at such high numbers that unnecessary incarceration for the entire pretrial period to assure that somebody is showing up to court really just seems overwhelmingly unnecessary, harmful, and again, expensive to taxpayers, which is what our report shows.
I'd like to add to that comment. I agree 100% with what you've said, Claire. What we've seen in the past 5 or 6 months as a result of the use of technology in courts, for appearances, because obviously many of the courts took advantage of remote technology and people were able to, make appearances, and the failure to appear levels have dramatically been reduced because people rely on technology in order to make those appearances. Now, the silver lining of this COVID-19 crisis on the courts is we are now examining technology that should be used for a variety of reasons going forward in the courts. And these type of appearances that you're talking about are a perfect example. There's a huge difference between someone, because of their lifestyle, because of their living conditions, because of many factors, don't make it to court, but that doesn't mean they're fleeing. That doesn't mean that they are not going to get there that afternoon, or they're not going to get there the next day. And as was mentioned, a reminder is necessary. But if we go a step further, and there is the ability to appear remotely, the failure to appear citations are going to just disappear, I believe.
Thank you so much, Chief Justice Sinclair, for your responses. I'd like to remind folks again, there are two ways to ask questions. You can unmute yourself and verbally ask, or you can drop the question in the chat to everyone or direct it to me privately, and I will ask the question. So again, any members of the media, please feel free to jump in, but we will open it up to all of our participants to ask any questions that they may have. And we did receive a question in the chat that just came in, and I would open it up to anyone who would like to chime in. I'll start with Claire. The question is, what are the barriers to possibly implementing these common sense reforms? Do we see any? Should this be an easy fix? What do we think?
Well, I think anybody who has worked hard to get something through our legislature knows that nothing is really an easy fix. But it should be an easy answer. And there's a reason why we call this common sense bail reform, because what we're advocating for is not crazy, it's especially reasonable. Our current system has people staying in jail not because of what they've done, not because of their likelihood of being culpable, but because of what they don't have. And what we are advocating for is actually whatever threat they may or may not pose being the determining factor of whether they stay in jail. What we want to do promotes public safety, and what this report shows, it would also save Ohio a ridiculous amount of money. So to go back to answer your question more directly, yeah, there are a lot of barriers. There are bail bond industries who understandably see their livelihood threatened by this kind of reform, who are concerned, and we expect to rally against this. Although I also do want to reiterate that what we are asking for is not an end to cash bail. What we're pushing for is an end to wealth-based detention. So we actually do see, and you'll see if you read our policy proposals, we're not asking to be like, Washington, D.C., where there is no such thing as cash bail anymore. I think that there are certain circumstances, limited circumstances, where cash bail could still be used. If somebody is really demonstrating that they are going to flee, it might make sense to have an additional incentive for them to come back to retrieve the money that they posted. So yeah, we definitely see different lobbyist efforts from various industries pushing back on this. We also, really curated these policy proposals, as I said at the beginning, to make sure that what we were proposing doesn't create impossibilities for smaller courts, for court systems that may have access to a smaller spectrum of pretrial services, because what we are proposing would save so much money. Our hope is that because that money would be saved, it would be able to be funneled into different alternatives. And so even those court systems that don't necessarily have access to a full spectrum, for example, of pretrial services now, could in the future if these cost savings were realized. And I'm sure there's many other people on our panel who have thoughts about how complicated it is to push through this reform, but I will say that I'm more optimistic than I think we've ever been that true reform could really happen. And that's because I truly think that, everybody who cares about justice and equity should see this as, really a moral question. but also everybody who cares about efficiency and fiscal impact analyses should also, given this report, really start focusing on bail reform.
If I may tag on to that, Claire, one thing that we see from an organization like AFP, it's a grassroots-based organization. So much of the barrier that we face with any of these, what are seemingly common sense reforms, is people don't realize how big the problem is. It's something that's out of sight to them. And we've seen over and over again that fortunately, most Ohioans have not had an encounter with the justice system that put them behind bars before they've been convicted. And due to that alone, education is the first and foremost for Ohioans. And from there, it's a matter of being able to have the ear of legislators. And when people understand it, legislators care a lot more about the issue. Fortunately, we've already got some great champions in the legislature that understand this issue and are actively working towards reform. First and foremost, there's that education factor for the public. And that's why it's great to have groups like ACLU and AFP working together to help spread that kind of awareness.
Okay, thank you for those responses. We have several questions that are coming into the chat. I would like to start with a hypothetical. We have a member of the press who is channeling a skeptical lawmaker from, say, a suburb in Cuyahoga County, coming up with the argument, we're going to create a revolving door if this sort of bail reform policy change was implemented. Say someone gets picked up for disorderly on Friday, they're released, then on Saturday, they are picked up again for trespassing or something similar. And the argument could be, at least with the current practice, we can interrupt bad behavior for a few days with the current system. So the member of the press is requesting a response to that hypothetical lawmaker, and what would our proposed reforms actually do? Claire, would you like to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity to kind of walk through our policy proposals by using this example. So again, our policy proposals are that most people do get released the same day that they're arrested, unless a judge or a prosecutor has a concern about their likelihood of willful flight or their likelihood of being a threat to a specific person. And so currently what we have is actually in most jurisdictions, including many of the suburbs, municipalities in Cuyahoga County, if that person had money, they would probably be able to bond themselves out via the bond schedule before they even see a judge. And if they didn't have money, they would remain in jail until they saw the judge, and then might again have the opportunity to post money based on whatever the judge says, or have to stay in jail if the judge did not give them an OR bond. What we're proposing is that in this case, if the person did demonstrate a threat of flight or a threat to a specific person, the court would be able to hold that person for 48 hours, and then within that 48 hours have a conditions of release hearing, where the hope would be, and it is mostly available in suburbs of Cuyahoga County, the judge could set any number of conditions of release that would assure appearance and the safety of specific individuals. You know, they could be put on a GPS monitor. They could be, even in some places, you know, required to undergo some mental health treatment. They could be given a pretrial supervision officer to connect with them. And so what we're actually doing here is disrupting what you're discussing. It's not creating a revolving door. It's making sure that the revolving door is based on what the person's actually doing and what a judge is seeing, as opposed to just whether or not they have money.
Thank you so much, Claire. We have a few more questions in the chat, and then we will pause again to see if there are any last verbal questions. I'm cognizant of the time. I'm wondering if we can start with the Chief Justice, and then others can jump in, including Claire. We had a question about Criminal Rule 46 and the changes that were implemented through that rule change versus the type of policy reform that we're talking about in this report. And if we could talk a little bit about the differentiation between those two things.
Sure. Rule 46 was a change to the court rule. What you're proposing is a change to the Ohio Revised Code. So there's the distinction right there. A court rule is changed by the majority vote of the justices, 7 justices. It takes 4 justices to change the rule. The Rule 46 that was passed was kind of a little bit watered down version of what the bail reform task force had suggested, but it was it was the version that appealed to most of the, the majority of the justices. And so that's, why we have that. It allows, for the continuation of the use of cash bail. It says, your first choice as a judge is a non-cash bail for release. But the discretion, I guess, or the conditions under which a judge can issue or impose a cash bond are more frequent than what you're proposing in the statute. Now, there's obviously 2 forums here, the court or the legislature. The legislature would, if the proposal that the ACLU is putting forth would, I think, be a more confined approach to bail. The judges would not have as broad a discretion as they do even under Rule 46. So again, that's a policy decision to be made, and whether the legislature will embrace that concept, I don't know. I truly have no way of knowing that. And I don't know what the opposition would be of members of the judiciary or the Ohio Judicial Conference, or groups that would weigh in on this. I can tell you that there's a lot of there's some states that this would be compared to, and whether they would be compared accurately, or whether it would be hyperbole, or whether it just would take on, like so many things do, the mantle of politics, and confusing information be disseminated. I don't know whether that would happen. The program that was passed, or excuse me, the policy statutes that were passed in New York, for example, have been held up as a failure, and for a variety of reasons. But that's much different than what you're proposing, or what I would imagine the legislature would propose as far as a statute here in the state of Ohio. New York took away the discretion for the most part to the judges, and there was there's been some consequences to that and some pushback, obviously, and criticism, a lot of criticism. I don't envision that version of bail reform or elimination of cash bail for the majority of cases would be what we in Ohio would support.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering, Claire, if you would like to talk a little bit about things from the policy side and why we opted for the policy proposals that we did in this report.
Absolutely. And also, to answer the original question about Criminal Rule 46, Criminal Rule 46 did do a number of positive things. So Criminal Rule 46 now specifies, for example, that judges must set the condition of release that's the least restrictive necessary to assure public safety and assure appearance. But it didn't go far enough into the details to make sure that that's actually what's going to take place in courtrooms. For example, that it requires that judges set a least restrictive condition, but it doesn't require judges to show why something was the least restrictive condition or what makes it necessary. And so if what's required is just a thought process internally in a judge's head, and it doesn't have to be, written on the records or stated on the record, and it doesn't have, then it's very hard to demonstrate that that thought process actually took place. And it's also incredibly hard to then appeal to demonstrate that it didn't take place. And so we understand that, because we also recognize that the legislature is really the best vessel to get into that level of detail. What standard of evidence do you need to make certain decisions? How do the written findings on the record have to be added? Those are the things that the legislature, the Ohio Revised Code, is supposed to go into that level of detail. And so we think that legislation is one of the best avenues for the kind of change that we're seeking, especially because Criminal Rule 46 did end up being slightly watered down. I also want to say that, you know, what we're proposing, again, does leave judges some discretion. We're asking judges to make determinations based on, again, an individual's riskiness for flight or riskiness if they make if they are causing threats to specific individuals. Right now, what we have is wealth-based detention. Right now, what we have is if somebody has money, they can buy their freedom. And if somebody doesn't have money, then they remain in jail. And then for those who are charged with the most significant, serious crimes, then preventative detention is also available. But what we're talking about currently, the current system, is if you have money, you buy your freedom. And if you don't have money, then you remain incarcerated. We want it to be that judges have the discretion, but that they're not focused on creating freedom based on what's in someone's pocket. They're setting freedom based on whether or not somebody is actually posing a threat. And again, we believe that most people should be able to be released pre-trial, and that judges should instead focus on what conditions of release would assure that safety and that appearance in court, as opposed to just unnecessarily causing someone to remain in jail. And that's really important because, as was said by a number of different speakers at the beginning of this panel, you know, people who are held in jail pre-trial are put at risk of losing their house, losing their job, even losing custody of their children. But also, cash bail and the way in which people are held pre-trial actually makes a mockery of our entire criminal legal system, because those held pre-trial are more likely to be convicted, more likely to be sentenced to jail and prison time, and their sentences are 2 to 3 times longer compared to individuals charged with the exact same crime who are able to purchase their release. And that makes sense. Exactly what you heard Maurice say earlier, that he wasn't able to very quickly get his timesheets to demonstrate his innocence because he was in jail. And he had family members who were working really hard for him on the outside, but it was very difficult for him to reach them successfully because of the limitations of being in jail. We need to make sure as a country and as a state in Ohio that it's culpability and not wealth that are shaping outcomes for individuals.
Thank you so much, Claire. And we are right at 11:30. So if there are any last reporter questions, I'd ask you to please drop them in the chat. If we can't respond right now, we'll get back to you later in the day by email or phone. But I do just want to ask Maurice just a quick follow-up question. I know you did mention how being in jail really put a strain on yourself and your employment, but also your family. And we know that your mom was critical to actually helping secure your release, and you missed birthdays, her 70th birthday, I think you said. Can you just talk a little bit about that toll on your family and what your mom was actually doing while you were on the inside?
Well, actually, when I was on the inside, she was out in 100-degree weather. Like I said, she's 70. She coming to visit me. She going to my job, checking up on my timesheet, because the judge that I had, she handwritten a subpoena, and from the courthouse and Procter & Gamble is only on 6th and Broadway. So, like, the attorney could have just went there, and it could have been like that because he had a handwritten subpoena. But it took another month for my timesheet to even come back. And then when it came back, they created a 20-minute window when I was still downtown at work to deny me an OR bond. So I'm still having a bond that's set at $500,000. My family's stressed out because they switched me floors. I'm up there, like now, I'm in a pod, but the pod that's next to me full of murderers, and you know what I mean? So it was stressing my family out. They asking, am I okay? They keep giving me money for commissary. It was just a stressful thing. Like my daughter, she had to call off work a lot of times to make sure she came to visit me. And then, like I said, if you didn't make, it's 100+ inmates in there using the phone. So like when my daughter come visit me, if the 15-minute phone calls weren't long enough to, you know, talk about it, so we had to when they visiting me, we talking about like, okay, we'll do this, look at this camera. Can you go to my job, talk to this person? Do they remember this day? Like, you know, and like I said, a lot of evidence was getting deleted over. Like I had caught the bus home and the shooting had happened in Price Hill. I lived in Western Hills, so that's a whole different route. Like I never go through Price Hill, so it was just a big stressed out thing. Like, cause when I was locked up, my sister and them still had to pay for movers cause I got evicted, so they had to move my stuff. 2 female women, like, you know, so it's just a big thing. Like it just costs a lot of stress, like, and money. Like I said, they paying for the phone calls, my commissary. We still had to pay for my attorney, and then I had to end up getting a new attorney because not saying he wasn't working hard. He was probably either busy or, you know, he probably felt a different way. So I just don't understand it. But like I said, it's a lot of people that I was incarcerated with that didn't have family members or, you know, money to pay for attorneys. So like, instead of having confidence and putting their faith in God and fighting for their life, they'd be like, oh, the quickest way I can get back to my family is if I take this short time, or okay, my case ain't this bad, so hopefully a case that they know they innocent on, they still take like a year or two. You know what I mean? You know, just cause so they can have an outdate. And it scared me because dude, like, oh yeah, I'm gonna be back with my family in this many days. And I'm like, well, if I lose my case, that time do sound good, so I should take it. Like, but I'm like, you innocent, like, don't do that. Like, and I'm just glad that I came up in a Baptist family, like we church. So God just came to me and like, just hold on, like I got you. Like I know you didn't do this, and I'm gonna perform a miracle, and that's what happened. I think he really performed a miracle for me, because in there you have no hope. You depend on everybody. You feel like you scum because you can't do anything for yourself. Like you got to rely on a phone call and a visit. That's it. You know what I mean?
Well, thank you so much for sharing again, Maurice. I am so sorry that you were put in that situation and that strain on yourself and your family. And I think it just goes to show the many problems associated with an over-reliance on cash bail and the wealth-based detention that it creates. And with that, we are at the end of our time. Again, thank you so much to all of our panelists. A digital version of our report is accessible online. It's at www.acluohio.org/bail report. Members of the press who are still on the line, if you'd like to follow up with us, please reach out to Selena Cumming. Her email is ccumming@acluohio.org. Have a great rest of your morning, everyone. Thank you so much.